Welcome to another episode of Healthy Politics, where we'll discuss the eternal intersection of healthcare in the United States and American politics. My name is Nick Karls. I'm the compliance director here at Holmes Murphy for the Employee Benefits Division. And with me is Den Bishop, our strategic extraordinaire mastermind, all of the good stuff, former president of Holmes Murphy. How are you doing today, Den?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
You know, clearly I've been reading too much of this big, beautiful bill because I can't even do my intro right anymore. Bear with me, all right? Bear with me.
Let's do a big, beautiful podcast. How about that?
I like that. Let's. Hey, I think that's we just got the title for the podcast. So, do we want to start with the big, beautiful bill, or do we want to talk about international sourcing to jump off?
Why don't we start with the pharmacy side of it, the executive order on that, on pricing and international sourcing, and then we'll move to the big, beautiful bill and the Medicaid issues there and the other pieces of that puzzle. So let's start with pharmacy.
Beautiful. How about you talk about the executive order, and I'll talk about some legislation we're starting to see.
All right. So President Trump issued an executive order. That was probably 3 weeks ago, about that time. And, what it really said was that the United States will have most favored nation pricing for brand name drugs. It was essentially what they're consistent with the Trump campaign of an America first, and that we are not going to let America get picked on by other countries economically anymore. And so it does make sense from the Trump campaign for him to say we will pay the same or less than any other country for prescription drugs. But how we do that and whether there is any legislative authority to pull that off is a massive question, and is totally unaddressed in the executive order.
Yeah, well, it's similar to some of the other executive orders we've seen, right? We're like, well, it's interesting policy, could be good. You need legislation to do it, right? You can't just force the pharmaceutical manufacturers to change their pricing, right? By executive order. However, it's got bipartisan support.
It does. And it was kind of interesting. In the executive order, he quoted some statistics, and I've read several things on that, and they're more or less correct. Anytime you take things, you can say, oh, is it twisted a little bit? But, in the executive order, it said, the United States is less than 5% of the world's population, and we're 75% of the profits for the pharmaceutical industry. And that is, in research I did for my last book, that is pretty close to accurate. That, in essence, the United States does fund the world's pharmaceutical industry. And this is President Trump's stance of saying, hey, we're not going to do that anymore.
And so when you look at that type of executive order, I wonder if we are going to see more situations where, President Trump has an executive order and it's regarding something that's a pressing need, right? We have to control our pharmaceutical costs. And so you have that, and it's something where both sides can look at it and go, yeah, we agree. And the tools are there legislatively, right? You could set certain pricing standards and all that, probably get challenged a little bit in the courts, but I'm sure someone could figure out a way to write it. So I think we might actually see some decent bipartisan legislation here if they can get past the spending bill that we'll discuss later.
Yeah, it would require legislative action, kind of linking back to when President Biden announced that Medicare would start negotiating drug prices for the first time. In that initial bill that passed, that was going to be for everybody. That wasn't just Medicare, it was anybody in the United States. But because of the Byrd rules in the Senate, they determined that the Senate didn't have the authority to do that without specific legislation. So in order for the government to pull off this executive order, which I do think both sides have a lot of support, it would require legislation that's going to try to take support from both sides.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where we've seen other bills being introduced. One of them was like the repeal of the employer mandate and some other things like that, where you look and you go, that's not just a budget thing. The Byrd rule, if we're going to do it through reconciliation or something like that, you're going to have 60 votes. So this is just theater, right? Whenever you see legislation, both sides do it all the time. They'll introduce legislation that has zero chance of passage because they don't have the votes, right? And so you look at that, and you're like, all right, you're never going to do this. Now here, they might actually get 60 senators to go along with it, right? The pharmaceutical lobby, maybe they're listening to this right now, will certainly have a word. They'll throw their hat in the ring, but it might happen.
Well, for 20 plus years, the industry that has spent the most on lobbying every single year has been the pharmaceutical industry. And so it was big tobacco before pharmaceutical, and for the last couple of decades, it's pharmaceutical. So they have a voice. Let's kind of stay on the pharmacy path and talk about bringing in drugs from other countries and support for that.
Yeah, well, and again, as it stands right now, because some of our listeners might already be doing some sort of importation program or whatever. We have some guidance from the government where it says, hey, if you're bringing drugs in for your own use, we're not going to enforce some of these rules as far as the drugs that you're bringing in just for your own personal use. However, there's this provision in there that says, but if you're doing it as part of kind of an economic program, if there's some sort of mercantile interest involved in it, that would be outside of it. So we're always kind of in this gray area for the import. Whereas with the executive order and with, again, some of the legislation we're seeing being proposed, it would allow people or different procurement groups, PBMs even, specialty ones, to procure drugs from other countries and import them into the U.S.
Yeah. So bottom line on pharmacy, the Trump administration is taking aggressive action to try to find a way to lower the price that we pay in the United States compared to what other countries pay. Now, let's go to the big, beautiful bill.
Right before we get to that, though, I will say I'm, with the bipartisan kind of approach to it, I would love it. One, because it might knock out some of the state laws that we're seeing right now. Because right now we have a patchwork of laws and it's not great. It's getting pretty confusing out there. And then on top of that, I'm spending a lot of time right now talking to our clients about ways to control their pharmacy spend, and they can get to be pretty difficult conversations. You're making some tough choices. And so the pressure is there, right? We have a significant issue. And so I'm hopeful that we see some action here and that hopefully they bring it as a single piece of legislation. I think it'll have a better chance of passing and it's not bundled in with some other laws. Because whenever that happens, as you and I know, the odds of it being unpopular increase with every additional provision you add to it. But the big, beautiful bill, Dan and I were talking about how that's just genius marketing because it's what it's called. You keep on calling that. You keep on saying it over and over again. The big, beautiful bill. Just introduced, has all sorts of health policy, healthcare related items in it. Dan, what did you think about the work requirements for Medicaid?
Again, similar to the pharmacy, would be on brand with the Trump campaign. Would be something that would say, hey, in order to keep your Medicare benefits, you're going to have to go to work or volunteer someplace. You can't just sit at home. That would be consistent with kind of Republican messaging that's there. Devil is in the details. On the Democratic side, the resistance to that is that it is very administratively complicated, and a lot of people would lose coverage based on administrative complexity, not simply the fact that they might or might not be working.
And I do think that there's something to that, just because we do see it all the time where a client will say, hey, the employee just found out that they were approved for Medicaid and it took 6 months plus whatever. And sometimes we see the paperwork and it can get pretty onerous. It can get pretty confusing. So I can kind of appreciate that part of the argument. The other piece is where you're looking at the way that the states fund Medicaid, the way that they get the full federal matching, dollars and taxing healthcare providers and some of that stuff. I'm going to be really, really curious to see what comes out of the Senate if we see something like that in the bill that comes out of the Senate.
Yes, it's, there are some things that are really complicated around how states collect money. So some of these hospital taxes, it's a shell game in order for the state to get more money out of the federal government. And so initially, what I understand in the bill, it was going to be eliminating those kinds of games. But what ended up in what the House passed is they said they would freeze it.
For those just listening in, Dan, I just did a little head bob side to side because it's like, it's not quite the same. It's not quite there, but it's not It's not completely different either, is it?
Well, the big complication, very few people understand Medicaid. And it is complicated in the way that it's financed. It's partially financed by the federal government, partially financed by the states. Every state gets a slightly different percentage.
Yeah.
And so some states have created mechanisms to get more. It's complicated.
Yeah, well, and it has to be complicated in some ways because we're talking about spending a lot of money to provide healthcare to a lot of people, right? It's not a small program and it involves a lot of dollars. And so, yeah, people are always legislators, industry, everyone's trying to find another way to squeeze out a few extra dollars to pay for it.
Yeah, and actually, far more people are covered by Medicaid than by Medicare, and most people don't realize that.
Sure.
We're at about 80 million people in Medicaid. We're 65 on our way to 70 million in Medicare. So Medicaid is still a larger program, but it is less popular with voters because voters don't understand it. If you say Medicare, everybody jumps on board and says, don't touch Medicare. You say Medicaid, and people go, I don't really understand what that is.
Yeah.
And so it is not surprising that the federal government, the Trump administration, is trying to find some cost reductions in Medicaid. They have to find it somewhere.
Yeah. So we had that piece to it, and that's gotten a lot of coverage. There were a couple of other healthcare related provisions in there, and I'm gonna tell you, Don, they got me scratching my head. I can't figure it out. I like to pride myself on being able to kind of see through the trees for the forest, right? One of them is codifying the ICRA, right? The individual coverage health reimbursement arrangement, where your employers are able to reimburse individual premiums. They want to come out with something called the choice plan. I haven't talked about it enough to remember what that acronym stands for. Consumer Health Option Insurance or something like that.
I don't even know what it stands for, but yes.
But it's codifying the ICRA. And a lot of it's pretty straightforward. An employer will be able to offer the option between the premium reimbursement or a fully insured group health plan. Because right now you have to offer one or the other to the group of employees. You can't offer both, so that you'd be able to offer both, and that's an interesting development. The other piece to it is $100 per employee that has qualifying coverage where they're having their premiums reimbursed. A $100 tax credit to the employer for those individuals. I don't get that one. You're incentivizing employers to set up this choice plan and to have employees utilize it and go get their own insurance as opposed to being on that fully insured group health plan. And the government is going to put money towards incentivizing employers to do that. Any guesses? Give me something.
So let me go back in time to when Ted Cruz was campaigning and Barack Obama was campaigning. So we're going way back for president. And on the same day, in two different campaign stops, they made virtually identical comments, essentially saying that employer-sponsored health insurance is a really bad idea. And if you kind of go underneath what is in Republican platforms, what is in Democratic platforms, both of them really don't like the tax deduction. It's the largest tax expenditure is employer-sponsored health insurance, and so that gets named and it's there. And so I think both sides for the last 20 years continually are looking for options other than just the employer-sponsored coverage, but where employers continue to pay most of the bill because we need employer money. And again, consistent with a Trump campaign on healthcare, more choice.
Sure.
His first time, excuse me, it was more choice, more choice. We are once again in a place even called it choice now, where we will open up from the restrictions around offering individual coverage to employees, and we'll put a carrot out there and even give the employer some money and say, hey, here's a little cash, $100, per person. Just let's try this, do something different, introduce more choice. It's on brand. It's confusing, but it's on brand.
Yeah, well, but I mean that would make sense if we're trying to move the market, if we're trying to have employers move more towards having individuals buy their own coverage and maybe helping to pay for it. This would be a way to start kind of, I don't want to use the word undermining a group health plan because that sounds nefarious, right? I mean,
It's not intentional. So if my own opinion of this, and this is not a red or a blue comment. This is a comment regarding history. In my entire career of watching federal government actions related to employer-sponsored health insurance, the very things that they think will help hurt, and the very things they get the opposite reaction out of things. And so it would, if you have a situation where individuals could have a choice between the employer-sponsored plan and individual coverage, it would not take too much time until the employer said, I can't offer this anymore. Everybody's just got to go over here. Just risk selection,
sure.
How it would work with a broader networks that are in employer-sponsored plans versus the narrow networks and individual coverage. And individual coverage plans are paying about, and this is, thumb in the air, get it about close. They're paying about half of what group sponsored plans are paying to hospitals. So if you think about it, I'll use Dallas-Fort Worth market. Commercial insurance is at about 300% of Medicare. That's about what hospitals are getting through Blue Cross, United, Cigna, everybody else. That's about what they're getting. The individual coverage plans or Obamacare plans, because they're the same things, those plans are paying 140, 150% of Medicare. So 150 versus 300, it's double. And so it would be very hard for an employer over time to compete
Sure.
with a plan where the cost of healthcare underneath that plan is half. And that is the current reality. Hospitals are very, very, very concerned about this kind of switch. I've had a few quiet discussions, and there's a lot of anxiety about, oh no, what may we have done to ourselves if this actually happens?
Sure. Well, we'll see what their lobbyists do, right? Because this has to get through the Senate. I'll let you take a break on your voice for a second there as I talk about some of the other fun stuff that we had in that bill. Because we had the choice plan. We're going to be watching that one closely. Again, just codifying the ability to reimburse premiums and having a little more choice with it. The other piece was a lot of HSA provisions. You had a piece in there about someone being able to have, if their spouse has a health FSA, that it's not impermissible coverage for the employee. Love that one. It would help a lot of employers out there, a lot of employees out there from running into some just kind of silly issues, right? Allowing those that have Medicare Part A to remain on the group health plan and contribute to an HSA. That's a good one. Allowing for individuals to have direct primary care up to, I think it was $150 per individual or $300 for a family, without that being impermissible other coverage. That's a very interesting one. They didn't have anything in there about telehealth or virtual health. I wonder if some of the telehealth folks will just kind of try to loop themselves in with direct primary care and say, it's direct primary care, it's just telephonic, right? That's what I would do, at least. So you have that stuff, and that all makes sense. And then you have some provisions where I'm still trying to figure out where they're going with this. For instance, for individuals making $75,000 per year, they would have their limit on how much they could contribute to the HSA increase from $4,300 to $8,600. For those couples making $150,000 per year, the limit would increase to $17,100 from $8,550. Though the lower income individuals are the ones that are least likely to participate in an HSA, right? To contribute to an HSA. The majority of contributions, the majority of people maxing out their contributions are higher wage earners. And so for someone making $75,000 per year, if they are contributing $8,600, that's 10% of their income. I don't know that a lot of those folks are going to have 10% to put into an HSA, where if they invested in the market, it can decrease in value.
But Nick, if you remember the name of our podcast, Healthy Politics, it's a political move. It doesn't mean anybody's really going to do it, because what's the criticism of HSAs is there are tax deductions for the wealthy. That's the
Sure.
criticism of those plans. So by making it where the limits are higher for lower income people, it could allow you to politically say, oh, but if you make less, you even could get more out of this. It's even better for you. Won't happen, doesn't really help anybody, but it does give you the ability to fire back on political criticism of your pet program.
It is. That was my best guess as well. Because beyond that, I couldn't figure it out. And there's all sorts of other complications. For instance, you generally wouldn't know how much you could actually contribute more until the end of the year, especially if you have fluctuating wages and stuff like that. So I think the most obvious answer is the correct answer in this situation. But as we said at the beginning of it just made it through the House. We had a 1 vote passage, right? Was it 215 to 214? Am I making that up? Is that correct?
I don't remember the numbers, but it was 1 vote. Yes.
1 vote goes to the Senate. Senate's already said that this is going to have one heck of a time passing in its current form. They, to expect substantial changes. So a lot more to come on this one. How long do we think it'll take the Senate to get their version out?
Oh, I'd need to look at the Senate calendar and figure out what the outside influence is, because it'll have to be something, an outside influence that says here's the deadline, or it never happens. But
sure.
You take a look at all of it and you go, okay, some federal government cuts to Medicaid, increasing choice, lots of different ways of increasing choice, the executive orders around prescription drugs. All of these are things that I think they're on point, consistent with what President Trump did in his first term. None of them are create a whole new healthcare system, a Medicare for all. Bernie Sanders they're not going there. They don't know what they would do. So they're pretty aggressively going at the existing system and trying to figure out how to lower cost.
Yeah. Well, and like the HSA changes, I think those are going to stick around. They generally don't cost the government anything. It's a pretty easy one. The choice one, I think in some version of it will survive. I don't know if that $100 payment to employers will survive because it costs money, right? And to your point, Don, I was surprised. I was expecting to potentially see the employer mandate penalty go down to $0 because that's something they could do through reconciliation. Didn't do that. And I haven't heard anything about the Senate putting that in, probably because it costs money, right? It's another tax that they would be getting rid of. So maybe that's part of the calculation. But like I said, we'll be watching this. Dan, do you have any other thoughts on this, or should we wrap it up?
No, I think that's a lot for the day.
We appreciate everyone listening in to today's episode. As we always say, it doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. If we talked about anything today that you found interesting or you want to discuss more, reach out to your Holmes Murphy representative. They know how to get in touch with us. No, happy to have that conversation. Otherwise, we look forward to talking to you with the next episode.